Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the Redwood Library in Athenæum. My name is Benedict Lecca, Executive Director, speaking to you from Newport, Rhode Island. First of all, I want to remind everyone that up top on the upper right, there is an audio button, the help button. So if you have any issues, audio issues, you click up there and hit the compatibility section, and all your problems will disappear. Also on the right, you'll be able to ask questions, and after the talk, I'll gather them, repeat them, and we will have our esteemed speaker respond to the questions. As we launch our lectures in honor of Black History Month, we're happy to have this evening with us Dr. Christopher Roberts, who will explore the life and work of Dr. Carter G. Woodson, considered the father of African American history. The second person, as I learned earlier this evening, to graduate with a PhD from Harvard. Dr. Roberts is a professor of theory, history of art and design at the Rhode Island School of Design. He earned a PhD in Africology and African American Studies from Temple University, and an MA in Ethnic Studies from San Francisco State University. He examines Black geographies of memory and forgetting, with an emphasis on port cities in the U.S. that anchored the transatlantic and domestic slave trades, Newport being one of them, of course. Prior to teaching at the Rhode Island School of Design, he taught at Brown University, where he was the Artemis A.W. and Martha Jakowski Postdoctoral Fellow at the Pembroke Center for Teaching and Research on Women. So I want to thank you, all of you, for joining us this evening, and please let's welcome Dr. Roberts.
Hello, I'm very glad to be here today, and I would first like to thank the entire Redwood Library and Athenæum staff, team, who've extended this opportunity to me, and I look forward to a very robust and exciting conversation today. So without any further ado, let's get to the presentation. Let's see. All right, view and present. All right, so at this time, everyone should be able to see the screen that is in front of you. So the life and work of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. All right. Before I begin, I would like to thank my ancestors, the Creator, my comrades, and my friends for the support and encouragement that has greatly contributed to my being here today. Moreover, this presentation does not exist without the diligent study and revisitation of Woodson's resonance to all of us by scholars such as Piero Deg Bovi, Greg Carr, Joshua Myers, John Henry Clark, Lorenzo Green, L.D. Riddick, Mcleod Bethune, and many others. It is in that tradition and intentionality from which this presentation emanates. My goal here today is not to provide you with an exhaustive account of Dr. Carter Godwin Woodson's life and work. To even think such a thing would go against everything Woodson stood for, and given his aversion to the idea that anything about the Negro in history could be adequately surmised in one sitting. Instead, I hope to highlight a few key points about Woodson's life, work, and influence, as well as his perspective and practice on scholarship that may prove timely today. Never a man of the university alone, Woodson was always thinking of ways to extend the reach of his work, and it is with that I will begin this Black History Month presentation. Carter G. Woodson. What you're looking at here is a sort of historical marker that is in the location where Dr. Carter Groveland Woodson was born. He was born on December 19th, 1875 in New Canton, Virginia, to Annie Eliza and James Henry Woodson. According to Berea College, where Woodson would attend, he was born into a family of nine children. He was born after 10 years the American Civil War ended. Thus, Woodson was of a generation that grew up in an American society where the hardships and discriminations caused by slavery were still alive. As the author Robert Durden states, he grew up in the lingering shadow of slavery. His father, James Henry Woodson, was a runaway slave from a plantation close to James River in Richmond, Virginia. James Woodson escaped after a conflict with his owner, joined the Union Army to fight for freedom of Black Americans, and earned his freedom around 1864. As Carr and Myers, among others, have stated previously, the conflict between Woodson's father and the person who enslaved him was a violent endeavor, along with other Union soldiers, where James Henry literally fought his way out of slavery. The information is instructive, if for no other reason, that it begins to shed some light onto the very unique trajectory from which Woodson emerges. And with that point, throughout the presentation, I will return to written remarks that I have throughout, and then at other junctures, I will sort of ruminate and reflect on those, and this is one of them. So something about Dr. Woodson that I really would like to highlight for the audience here today is that when we think about sort of the arc of, like, what are the traditions of Black scholarship and Black historical learning and Black thinking, there are certain names that, particularly to those of us who grew up in the Black community around Black folks who were just living, thinking, and being, there are certain names that always come to mind, right? Those would be W.B. Du Bois, Mary Mcleod Bethune. You could talk even on the sort of inventor side, names that you'll hear frequently, such as Garrett A. Morgan, Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Rosa Parks, right? All these cliche names. Paul Laurence Dunbar, we could go on. One of the people that I think a lot of people may hear his name but don't necessarily know a lot about is Dr. Woodson. And as I was mentioning to Benedict a bit earlier before we started, yes, it is true that W.B. Du Bois is the first Black person to earn a PhD from Harvard University. However, Dr. Woodson is the second, and is, again, some of the scholars I've mentioned, such as Myers, Carr, and others, have stated whenever given the opportunity, Dr. Woodson was the second, and he's the only one who did that, being the son of enslaved Africans, right? He will be the only person ever to be born into slavery and then get a PhD from Harvard. And that's not to sort of valorize Harvard in any way, shape, or form. It's instead, or rather, to speak to the dynamism of the life that Carter G. Woodson lived. This is a man who attended Berea College in Kentucky right before Berea went back to, it was integrated. This is interesting, right? This is a school that was integrated. Woodson was in one of the last classes that was, quote, so integrated. Literally just a couple years after he finished, the school became segregated again and continued to be segregated up until 1954. And he is someone who made his way to DC. He taught in the Philippines for a period of time. He also worked in the coal mines. Again, him being from Virginia, he worked in the coal mines of West Virginia. And I think, again, as I've said, others have stated this, but what I want to highlight here for you all is that when we think about the journey that people take and sort of what things matter to them, if you look at sort of Du Bois's trajectory, in many ways, it is a trajectory of where he was on a track to an elite university or an elite college. Like, he was on a certain trajectory. We see this with others. I think Woodson, part of what makes Woodson so unique is that it took him 6 years to finish undergrad. It took him bouncing around to different places to find his niche. It wasn't this like smooth and easy road. Also, he was someone who very constantly was thinking about everything that he was doing in terms of it being connected to a university or to an institution, he wasn't solely interested with making it. What he was also interested about was, like I said in the outset, the reach of his work and the reach of his influence. And Woodson is someone who models for a lot of us thinking across generations, right? He is someone who, in every issue of the Negro History Bulletin, which I will allude to a bit later, there was almost always a children's corner or a children's section. There was a book of the month. There were, and he has another text that you can locate, which is called The Mind of the Negro. And The Mind of the Negro, for me, again, it's not in the sort of scope of the presentation today, but I really like The Mind of the Negro because what it is largely a collection of letters that Black people wrote to each other during slavery. And what I really, and why I wanted, one of the reasons I wanted to highlight Woodson and use his life and work, is why I chose those two terms, life and work, as a way to frame this conversation, is I think that Dr. Woodson lived his life in such a way where he wasn't primarily concerned with what the white world thought about it. He wasn't concerned with what the United States or the country thought about it. His primary concern was what he could do for Black people wherever they were in the world. And I think he literally, if you read about him, if you were to study him, should you be so fortunate, what you'll find is that Dr. Woodson spent pretty much every waking moment trying to chronicle, share, and unpack the life and history of Black people wherever they were in the world. And when you look at his life trajectory, right, the son of folks who were enslaved, a father who fought his way off of a plantation, a mother who learned literacy at an early age, and in the words of Dr. Carr, really made sure that not just Dr. Woodson, but all of her children could read and write. When you really combine his trajectory and you look at this person, again, coming literally out of a situation that many would think of as impossible and doing what he did, I think it's one of the stories that, as I get to the end, there are reasons we don't hear a lot about Dr. Woodson, right? And I'll get to that a bit later. But I know that many of you are here, right, to learn about Black History Month. I know that's, in short, the reason a lot of people came, so to speak, right? And we will absolutely get to Black History Month during this presentation. However, I'd like to actually begin with a little bit of framing of Dr. Woodson and his particular perspectives on Black history and Black life. The text for which he is most widely known is titled The Miseducation of the Negro. However, prior to that, he published The Education of the Negro in 1919, a whole 14 years prior to the release of Miseducation. The Education of the Negro reads as a book of promise and potential, whereas Miseducation is a searing indictment on the potential unreached possibilities and the limits of promise within a white supremacist society. So The Education of the Negro, really since 1861, is sort of the subscript there. But this text is, and you have to understand, Woodson's a historian through and through. He is a lot of other things. He's also an archivist. He's a writer. He's an editor. I would probably say editor, historian, among sort of most prominently how he showed up in the world. But a lot of what Woodson did was to really present to us the context, the time, right? To really provide us with really where Black people were in history, right? And he takes us to the question of the education of the Negro, right? The approaches to it, the ideas on it that were around, particularly from 1861 on. And what you'll see on the page is an excerpt from that text that comes from a chapter in it called The Reaction. So the preceding parts of the text are Woodson setting up the history of Black education in what has come to become the United States, where you constantly had Black people making a way out of no way, learning to read under threat of death, creating their own sort of what James Anderson refers to as Sabbath schools, to doing the work of creating all types of subterranean, and by subterranean, I mean outside of the gaze of the white world, spaces where they could learn, think, and be. So you had that already. But as the Civil War became more of a reality, there was a debate among sort of the white ruling class about what to do with Black people, right? And these are in multiple, should the Confederacy win the war? Should the Confederacy lose? Regardless of wherever that war was going to end, it was fairly clear that the, quote, Negro question, as it was termed at the time, was something that needed consideration. And there were different ideas. There were different theories. There was the American Colonization Society, which had traction among a wide swath of groups for a wide swath of reasons. That's a very interesting conversation. I could forward you to sources on the ACS, but that's not exactly what we're here for today. But it is important to know that there were groups of people who thought that a potential solution was the enslaved Black population, or should the Union win, the formerly enslaved Black population going to the African continent in situations, such as Liberia and others, where you would have this Black population sort of moving to the African continent. That was one approach. You had an approach, and then it sort of boiled down to a question of, okay, either so they could leave or they could be sent away. If these formerly enslaved folks stay or are kept here, the questions then became, well, what do we do with them? Do they become citizens? Do they vote the same as us? Do us being white people, of course, right? Do they vote, white men more precisely? Do they vote as we do? Do they participate in civil society the way that we do? Do they marry as we do? There's a whole host of questions. But one of the bigger ones was, well, do they become educated? And there was more or less a consensus among that white ruling class, be they business, be they philanthropic, be they sort of educators, be they planters, right? Or be they politicians, be they abolitionists, right? Across the spectrum, whether you were a, quote, liberal abolitionist or a sort of conservative planter, very few, if any, in those classes of the white population at the time thought Black people as a large group equal to whites. The question, it was more a matter of, why are Black people unequal, right? Are they unequal due to some sort of irreversible biological, spiritual, predetermined thing? Or is there inequity or their inability to rise to the status of the, quote, more civilized peoples of the world due to their status as enslaved? And if that status leaves, they will then become, quote, could be equal, could be educated, could be good citizens. And it's within that context that I now want to read this excerpt from Woodson. And there are multiple phrasings and multiple editions of this, but I'll read this one here. This is him talking about some of the reaction among many in the white community to arguments coming from Black as well as some white people that, well, we need to educate these Black people if they are to be citizens, if they are, and even if they're still enslaved, that there are to be better workers. So there was an argument that you want to educate this population so they can be better workers, or you want to educate them so they can be better citizens. But as soon as, quote, education came on the table, Woodson observed the following: feeling that with regards to the body politic, as conceived by Locke, Montesquieu, and Blackstone, the slaves were generally doomed to live without any enlightenment whatever. Thereafter, rich planters not only thought it unwise to educate men, thus destined to live on a plain with beasts, but considered it more profitable to work a slave to death during 7 years and buy another in his stead than to teach and humanize him with a view to increasing efficiency. There's a later version that reads that section in the following way. Many of the planters believed that the slightest amount of education, merely teaching slaves to read, impaired their value because it instantly destroyed their contentedness. Since they did not contemplate changing their condition, it was surely doing them an ill service to destroy their acquiescence in it. This revolution, referencing the Civil War and the subsequent Black uprisings that surrounded it, including what Du Bois refers to as the, quote, general strike, this revolution then had brought it to pass that slaves who were, during the 18th century, advertised as valuable on account of having been enlightened, were in the 19th century considered more dangerous than useful. So that's Woodson there in part, right? Woodson is constantly and always concerned with the question of education, with the question of learning, with the question of what he refers to as like sort of the Negro in history or the Negro in the past, right? He's thinking about, or one of his major concerns is, what is it that this prompt or this topic of education tells us about the world we live in, and who these people who govern for us, think for us, act for us, do for us, who it is that this population, right, this, quote, white world, so to speak, those beyond, the veil that Du Bois references, right? Who do they believe Black people to be, and what do they ultimately deem Black people as deserving of? And if you notice that excerpt I read from Woodson, he states that one of the hesitancies around education becoming something that was more widely supported for Black people was this idea that it would destroy their contentedness, right? And that's a heck of a phrase right there, right? It was surely doing them an ill service to destroy their acquiescence in it being slavery. So Woodson is highlighting this idea that Black people being present in a place equals Black people agreeing with what's going on in that place, right? If they didn't like it, they would leave, right? If they didn't like it, they would resist. If they didn't like it, why are they here? And I bring that up to very quickly sort of jump in terms of a timeline to a lot of the rhetoric that we hear today, right? Whenever Black people critique the nation state or critique the country or critique the ruling government, whichever party it may be at the time, there is often a critique or something that is leveraged at Black people, which is, well, if you don't like it, then leave. Well, if you don't like it, why are you here? Well, why aren't you burning everything down? Why aren't you storming the halls? Why aren't you doing this and that? And the past few weeks ago, notwithstanding, in many ways, Black people have always been resisting and disrupting, and Black people have, as a whole, there's no period in which people have been content with the system that they are in. Rather, it is a question of, what do we really define as resistance? What do we define as revolution? What do we define as an assertion of life on one's own terms, right? Not because many of the ways that we discuss, one of the reasons that the US American Revolution is understood as like a proactive assertion, right, is because it's seen as people who were, quote, already people, resisting people who were oppressing them, right? Whereas the slave revolts or the slave rebellions or the uprisings or the general strike, like C.L.R. James has a whole text on, the revolts of enslaved people. We have, again, Du Bois's Black Reconstruction with a whole chapter on the general strike. Like, these are not seen as revolutions in the way that, again, the US American Revolution is, or the Russian Revolution, or sort of the Age of Revolution that the West likes to think of. And part of why that is goes exactly to Woodson's point here, is that those people who were considered, quote, slaves or enslaved were not seen as part of that body politic in the first place, right? You have to be human, or you have to be a person to wage revolution, to espouse the beliefs of Locke and others at the time, right? You have to be seen as a person, and Black people who were enslaved were not seen as that. So what this whole section kind of brings us to are two things. One, what does it mean if during the 1800s, it was very clear to those in power that education was dangerous, right? That to learn how to read, to learn how to write, right? In a very practical sense, there are a bunch of scholars like Benjamin Quarles, right, who was also considered one of the boys, quote unquote, of Woodson's, right? And I bring up Benjamin Quarles, former professor at Morgan State University, in part because he actually taught my mother when she was an undergrad there. So in some ways, I kind of stayed in that tradition as well. But scholars such as Quarles and others have no shortage of texts where they discuss how reading was something that enslaved people, should they learn the skill, were able to use to create and find pathways to manumission, to sort of leave their mark on different documents, to really one of the reasons that Frederick Douglass's narrative becomes so important is because of this idea of what it means for someone who's enslaved to also be able to author their experience, not merely dictate it to others, right? As we sort of see with like a lot of the WPA records. But Woodson was onto it very early that there was something about this education question that people who wanted to continue to oppress Black people knew that this education thing was a key. And Woodson knew, okay, if it's a key for those who want to, as he says here, if it's a key for those who thought it unwise to educate, right, men thus destined to live on a plane with beasts, quote unquote, he knew that it also must be a way to get out of that very system as well. So one of the things that's important to know about Woodson is that education was paramount. Education was the thing that constantly brought him back to whatever. And education, not simply as a obtaining of information. That's really the other key part here is Woodson was not someone who inhaled information and kept it to himself in order to enhance his profile. He took information in so immediately that he could push it out, right? We see this through the association, which I'll get to later. We see this through the Journal of Negro History. We see this through the Negro History Bulletins. So that's the education of the Negro. Beyond that, or next, I'll come to, again, one of the reasons that I know a lot of people here are curious about and interested in, which is Negro History Week. So, and this here comes from the text by Piero Degbovi, who says that Negro History Week was the first major achievement in popularizing Black history and was unique in that it focused on the Black youth. Woodson realized that the miseducation of Black people began in their homes, communities, and elementary schools. He therefore targeted these sites aggressively, focusing on the schools. Woodson's strategy of gradually introducing Black history as a supplement to mainstream American history was pragmatic and part of a core expansive vision and agenda. Woodson realized that if he had demanded that Black history be integrated into the American educational system all at once, his plan would have been too easily dismissed. And that's one aspect of Negro History Week that I would like to reference. And another sort of comes from a curriculum that, again, you'll notice I mentioned a lot of names a lot, people through the organization, ASCAX, folks such as Dr. Greg Carr and others, again, through also local chapters of ASALA, formerly the Association for Negro Life and History, now the Association for African American Life and History. They produced a document that is used still in the Philadelphia public school systems that says, in February 26, Carter G. Woodson established Negro History Week, an event designed to allow schools and individuals across the United States the opportunity to display what they had learned over the previous year with regard to Americans of Africa, with regards to Black people globally. He chose the second week in February for the celebration because it contained the birthdays of Frederick Douglass, February 14th, 1818, and Abraham Lincoln, February 12th, 2009. The celebration was promoted by Woodson's adopted fraternity, Omega Psi Phi Fraternity Incorporated, and was expanded officially to a month in the mid-1970s, 1976 to be exact. And what I think that Degbovie here, just in this quote alone, does a really, really good job of is kind of setting up, right, part of the conversation in terms of like Woodson's thinking here, right? And one of the things that he, as I've said before, was always keen on was how to expand the reach of a message, right? How to move these things forward. And Degbovie goes on to say that linking the past, present, and future, Woodson's vision of Negro History Week was optimistic and long-term. The seemingly token celebration was to serve as a stepping stone towards the gradual introduction of Black history into the curricula of educational institutions from the elementary school years through college, throughout American communities, Black and white. He wanted Negro History Week to evolve, per Degbovie, even into Negro History Year, as he noted from time to time. Routinely, Woodson instructed those observing the week that they need to diligently prepare for the celebration months in advance, and that after mid-February, they need to continue acknowledging the role of African descendants in the world. Quote, and this is from Woodson, Negro History Week should be a demonstration of what has been done in the study of the Negro during the year, and at the same time, a demonstration of greater things to be accomplished. Woodson instructed school teachers, a subject which receives attention 1 week out of 36 will not mean much to anyone. And I think that begins to kind of frame some of the major misunderstandings around Black History Month. I think that, unfortunately, as happens in any sort of, neoliberal society, there's co-optation, and sort of the way the capitalism works on top of that is that if you can capitalize on something, if you can commodify something, if you can turn something into a sort of product that is sort of viable and sellable, what happens is that with every stage of that mainstreaming, with every stage of that, I guess what Woodson at the time foresaw with an increase in, even though he was someone who very much wanted to expand reach, he knew that you had to be vigilant about what it is that you were expanding, because it may expand so much that it might not even be what you envisioned. So let's go back to a couple of things I said. One of them is the question of the month, right? There's often this question about why is it the shortest month in the year? I hope that was answered here in the presentation. It wasn't because February is a short month. It wasn't that anyone assigned, and this is sort of, again, part of the move. Oftentimes people think, oh, it's in this short month of February because that's what white people wanted, right? That's a centering on whiteness that Woodson wasn't primarily interested in. He was really concerned about what days already matter to Black people, right? And of course, you have birthday of Douglass, birthday of Lincoln, two people who matter a lot within how Black history and Black life is understood in this country. So since Black people, per Woodson's logic, would already be thinking about like history, past, like place in the country, place in the world, sort of what it means for Black people to reflect on, figures such as these. He was like, okay, this is already a time when people are thinking, all right, let's lock in on that. So it was like, okay, February 12th, February 14th. And as you see from Degbovie's text, which really is based on, and why I mentioned Lorenzo Johnston Green briefly, Lorenzo Johnston Green was considered one of the proteges of Dr. Carter G. Woodson. And he also is from the New England area, Connecticut specifically. And he wrote one of the major texts, Blacks in New England, which I would say still consider one of the sort of major texts if you were to try to understand a Black perspective on Black history, right? Again, these are historians. So Green really produces a text that chronicles the history of Black life in New England. But that's, again, another text that we can get to perhaps in the Q&A. But I think if you think about this way, right? Negro History Week, 1926, becomes Black History Month, 1976, right? So there's a you have, okay, like 1865, 65, 66, you really, depending on how you're counting here, historically speaking, you have the end of the U.S. American Civil War. 60 years roughly out from that, you then get Negro History Week. Another 50 years after that, you get Black History Month. And again, some of the people who I study in part to prepare for this presentation, they often discuss that there's this misconception that the federal government pushed Black History Month becoming Black History Month, or it was some sort of federal impetus for it. Per the historians that I've studied, per the scholars who I've studied, their view on it is much more that the association took a proactive role in this move from Negro History Week to Black History Month, right? It was a decision that came in large part from the people at the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History, again, which would become ASALH in the future. But the point here is that it wasn't, and this goes back to Woodson's thing, it wasn't a gift, right? Black History Month was not a gift given to Black people by a sort of governmental and societal structure that marginalizes them. Instead, it was something that Black people asserted that was important. And also, again, it was something that had already been happening within Black communities, irrespective of what the dominant structure was doing. And I think that's sort of the next part I want to highlight. Just maybe one other thing from Dagbovie on Black History Month, which kind of goes to the point about sort of how things have shifted. And you'll notice from what I read from Woodson earlier, he in fact says himself that if you study something one week out of 36, it's not going to matter to a lot of people anyway. So there's this thing where people, okay, well, we'll study this for these 4 weeks, or we'll study this for this 28 or leap year, 29 days, depending. And then we will go back to the program as usually scheduled. Woodson's point was that you study all 11 months, and then we reflect and celebrate and engage what was studied that 12th month, right? I also think it's worth saying in this space that Woodson was primarily concerned with the Black community and what Black people were thinking about. That said, he did, sorry, I dropped a sheet of paper. He was still hopeful that the work that he was doing and the things that he was engaged in would reach white audiences, would resonate with them in some way, but it's very clear that wasn't his primary concern. If there were white audiences that were so moved, that was great. If not, again, those were not his primary concerns, let's just say. And continuing with Negro History Week, I believe I'd mentioned probably a bit earlier to Benedict and Patricia that I'm from Baltimore, Maryland originally, and I actually thought this excerpt here really struck me, and it's from one of the Negro History Bulletins in the 1940s, and you'll notice in the center it says, window exhibit at the Enoch Pratt Library in Baltimore. And I grew up actually going to Enoch Pratt Library. And I think that this image, and then you'll notice, I'm not going to read through all the text, but basically the text that's on this entire page is Woodson basically providing updates in the bulletin of how people have been preparing. This is the February issue, but he's highlighting how people have been preparing for Black History Month. He says that in Detroit, they've been doing this, and in Chicago, they've been doing that. And, at Cheney, which is now Cheney University, but he talks about at Cheney State College, they're preparing for this, right? The 100th anniversary, which was celebrated a little while ago at the time of this publication. But the point that I'm making here is that Negro History Week at the time was a culmination, right? It wasn't this sort of token moment. It was really a culmination of a year's worth of study. a couple other interesting stories that I kind of want to share in the time that we have left. One of them is 25 Negro History Weeks, which actually comes from L.D. Riddick. So 1950 of May, this is about 25. We've had 25 Negro History Weeks at this point. L.D. Riddick, who was another protege of Dr. Woodson, he wrote in a different issue of the Bulletin, he was talking about his reflections 25 weeks out. And also 1950 is the year that Dr. Woodson transitions or passes on. So you saw multiple scholars offer reflections during this time. Excuse me. One of the things that Reddick remarked was that of Woodson, he said his greatest influence upon the public mind came through Negro History Week. He says the Negro History Week was one of the most significant movements ever started in the interest of the Negro race. And he also adds that one of the things that was important for Woodson was this idea that there should be no indulgence in undue eulogy of the Negro. The case of the Negro is well taken care of when it is shown how he has influenced the development of civilization really in the world. So another thing for Woodson was that you didn't need to sort of construct or manufacture facts or things about Black people. You didn't need to fabricate or make up anything. You didn't need to lie in any way, right? The story and the lives that Black people have led tell the story themselves. And that's really a big part of understanding Woodson, is that he, at least when I look at his work, I really read it as someone who sought to create a platform to tell the story of Black life, or tell a story of Black life, rather. Now I've only got a couple minutes left, so I want to get to at least one of the figures in this picture. I hope some of you recognize the person who's holding hands with Dr. Woodson. That is Dr. Mary Mcleod Bethune. That is a woman who founded what is known today as Bethune-Cookman College, and she's one of the most important educators of any race and gender, but one of the most important Black women educators of the 20th century. And she really, once Dr. Woodson transitioned, Mary Mcleod Bethune in many ways took the helm at Asala for a while there. And she talks about his sort of work ethic being a model for her. This is a woman who herself basically founded a college that would eventually become a university. And the association, again, is really important because during Woodson's time, and I'm going to wrap up, I'm going to set my timer for about next maybe 2-3 minutes and then we'll be done. But one of the things that I really want to make clear in this framing of Woodson is that he coexisted along a lot of his peers who took a lot of money from sort of these white benefactors, right? This is also the era of the Harlem Renaissance and patronage. And though it wasn't exactly the way it showed up for artists and others, it still existed for someone like Woodson, right? This idea of being funded and being resourced by sort of white money or these sort of government funds and organizations. Woodson, though, was concerned with a level of autonomy that was paramount to him, that he was concerned with telling the story his way. And financially, there were consequences for that at times. But those who knew him, those who were close to him, even honestly, those who liked him or disliked him, it seems by and large respected the fact that he stood on his own principles and his own values. In the coming of Black History Month, 1976, I wanted to highlight another issue from the Negro History Bulletin. This is a while before Black History Month sort of becomes, quote, Black History Month as we know it today. However, what you're looking at here is a cover from the 1961 Negro History Bulletin. And again, why I want to highlight it is that Black people have always been studying ourselves, learning about ourselves. Other people are just, coming to learn that, right? So I want people to, my suggestion, especially to an audience like this, is insofar as you engage Black History Month, it might be useful to not think of it as what are you bringing to a community, because that community already knows and is already aware that it needs to study and needs to engage. It's what can people learn that they don't already know, right? Because so often, especially how whiteness usually dominates and works in our society, is that those in power, those who have an elevated status, believe it's always their job to bring, to educate, right? Whereas this is an instance of needing to be educated, needing to take a step back and say, like, you're not the expert in this, not the official sort of arbiter of what is known or relevant here. Again, Dr. Woodson, far and away, is one of the most prominent, and that's actually Mary Mcleod Bethune, for those who are interested, in the top left of that display case that the young woman has there. But Dr. Woodson, for many of us, changed the trajectory of our lives. I grew up, like I said, in Baltimore, which is a largely Black community, and in my public schools, we had Black History Month programming all the time, and we had to dress up as different people from history. We had to learn different things, and all that comes out of the same tradition, right? The same way that she's doing this presentation, right? Like a young kid like me, 30, 40 some odd years later, was in elementary and middle school, still doing presentations on Black history. And I actually think that's pretty cool. And so here's what I want to close with. I know I'm a couple minutes over, but this part is important and it's timely. So I want to take my time with it. This is from the Negro History Bulletin, 1943. And sort of every bulletin, Woodson kind of framed it. This is the February one as well. So Woodson kind of frames them with this sort of cover image that sort of serves as a prompt for his like first page, right? Where he sort of writes this sort of intro or primer for the bulletin of that month. And in this one, I just want to read one paragraph that Woodson has in here, where he says, Frederick Douglass once said that Abraham Lincoln, and this is actually at the dedication of this monument. Frederick Douglass once said that Abraham Lincoln was the first white man he ever met who did not say something or do something to make him feel that he was a, quote, colored man at the time, right? So that sounds like, good white liberal person, right? Still, Frederick Douglass. Yet, when Douglass delivered the eulogy on Lincoln on the occasion of the unveiling of the Freedmen's Monument in memory of the emancipator in Lincoln Park, Washington, D.C. on April 14th, 1876, in the presence of President Grant, his cabinet, members of Congress, and the most distinguished foreign representatives, Douglass took occasion to say emphatically to the white persons present that Lincoln was their president, not the president of the Negro race. Lincoln repeatedly declared that he would save the Union with slavery if he could. We fully comprehend, this is Woodson again, the relation of Abraham Lincoln both to ourselves and to white people of the United States. Truth is proper and beautiful at all times and in all places, and it is never more proper and beautiful in any case than when speaking of a great public man whose example is likely to be commended for honor and imitation long after his departure. To the solemn shades, the silent continents of eternity. It must be admitted, truth compels me to admit, even here, in the presence of the monument that we have erected to his memory, Abraham Lincoln was not, in the fullest sense of the word, either our man or our model. In his interests, in his associations, in his habits of thought, and in his prejudices, he was a white man. And in 2021, when Black people across the country are being told not to complain at all about the liberal white Democratic Party, for whom they are both simultaneously savior, see the discourse around Stacey Abrams, among others, and saved, see the discourse around suppressing progressive positions in the white party, I'm left to reflect on Woodson's words. Who are the emancipators to the emancipated? And will that relationship ever be one that gets us closer to freedom and not just a granting of a temporary emancipation? And these are my thoughts this Black History Month. and I'll stop there. I think that should
Thank you very much, Chris. Very interesting. One of the questions that I have is, why is Mr. Woodson so? How come we haven't heard about him? Why is he erased from the historical record in many ways?
Yeah, thanks about that. I know. Also, just wanted to apologize. I had a ring light that was great, but of course, as soon as I started, it fell. So hopefully, this will be a bit brighter, everybody. But to the question, I think it's really interesting because in part it depends on where, right? Like where we are asking the question of who knows, because there are in many cities local chapters of these sort of Black historical communities, whether they be public school teachers or local historians who know plenty of Woodson. But I think if we're looking at sort of the broader historical academic spectrum, one of the things I learned actually reading Deg Bovey's text was about Woodson's relationship with the AHA, right? So the American Historical Association, I would actually in part probably direct that question to them, actually, because one of the things that I learned in researching was that when Woodson passed, his death was barely mentioned by the AHA. Also, interesting historical note, Woodson died the same year as Charles Drew, the famous doctor. And there's some speculation that Drew's death also maybe smothered some of the fervor around Woodson. But honestly, to be blunt with you, I think that Woodson, this is one of the moments where I would highlight his distinctions from Du Bois, right? And many others, because Du Bois, though critical of the sort of the powers that be, whether they be academic or institutional, he was always involved in some way, right? He was someone who basically, when push came to shove and it was like, all right, we can take this money, we can do this project, but it comes with these strings. You could have had 10 people in the room and 9 of them would have said, yeah, this isn't ideal, but we'll do it. Woodson was already out the door, right? Like he was not going to take it. He wasn't going to take any money. He wasn't going to take any resources if he didn't feel that he had adequate control over the project. So to answer your question, I think he didn't make a lot of friends with those who would have ensured that he'd be discussed in some of the historical canons. On a good note, though, I think some of that is changing. I think that as there becomes, this sort of renewed interest in Black History Month and sort of studying this work, I think just, out of, okay, where did this thing begin? Like, I think people are starting to look back. So hopefully this will be a time when there can be a lot more of an engagement, right, of his work. But I think part of it is that, again, I guess just to put it plainly, he didn't make a lot of friends with the people who would have put him in those types of historical traditions. But he has long been remembered in other historical traditions, right? Sort of Black intellectual traditions and Black studies and ethnic studies traditions. But within sort of the broader historical world, he did not, I don't know that he even cared, but to maybe, be more precise with it, he didn't ingratiate himself with the archivists and the historians and his contemporaries. Especially, and I would just reference the AHA piece as like a direct example that I learned about that really was enlightening for me. Like, how did the American Historical Association respond? And apparently it wasn't that much at all.
It makes me think a lot how Black history is a contested space. There are versions, critical positions that are taken. That last quote that you mentioned, where he talks about Abraham Lincoln, is quite pugnacious.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
And it to me brings up a bit of the contrast between Black history in terms of the contributions, a sort of more historical, a more benign historical positive, whereas some might see that as more muscular and political.
Yeah, right, a provocative one, and very political. If I may respond to that a bit, I thank you for that question, Benedict, because what it allows me to do is, I think, refer back to Woodson's initial thinking behind the week, right? So his thinking behind the week was that this would be an opportunity for those interested in the topic or those interested in Black education, whatever that meant, whether that was K through 12, whether that was elders, whether that was educators, whether that was school teachers, people who are interested in this thing of like educating Black people wherever they are in the world. It's a time to review what they've already done, not necessarily a time to begin the doing. He was thinking of February as, okay, we've done stuff all year. Let's just come together and talk about what we did and how we can do better the next year. So that's one part. He really envisioned this as a culmination of previous study, not a iteration of like, okay, we're going to start studying now. So that's one part. The second part is that, and if you look, sort of the association still exists. Asala that I referenced quite a bit. Asala, the theme for this year, I believe, is the Black family, representation, media, and a couple of other things. So they're kind of keeping in his tradition as well. So that year where he talks about the statue, that was in many ways what drove some of the contributors to the Negro, to the Bulletin that year. So if you think about this, like most bulletins work, right? You solicit maybe 5 or 6 authors, you have a selection that the editors make of a book of the month. It was that kind of thing. You got to think about it in that sense. So he was thinking thematically as well. He was thinking that, okay, what is bringing us together this year? Perhaps it's this, perhaps it's that. So for Woodson, yes, it had the celebration, it had the pomp and circumstance, it had it had all of those things. But for him, those things were there, but they weren't ever why he was there. If that makes, you know what I mean? Like, I think if that makes sense, right? Like, those things were there, the celebrating of the achievements, the progress, the moving forward. That was important, and he thought that was had a place, but it was there, but it wasn't why he was there. Why he was there was to really ask these pertinent questions of where are Black people as a collective in this country. And remember, he's asking, that excerpt I showed you is in the 1940s, and that's when you have a lot of Black people who are in the military fighting abroad for freedom while they're still experiencing oppression back home. So it makes sense that someone like Woodson is perhaps critical of sort of a certain narrative arc of progress that the nation has relative to Lincoln and others, when he's looking around and he's seeing, okay, Black people are going off dying at war, yet there's still this, Black only, white only, I mean, he's grappling with the reality that he's seeing at the time, especially in the 1940s. Where you have a country like the US that on the one hand says that we're sort of anti-fascist, we're against the Nazis, we're against these very biologically or religiously deterministic oppressive views of populations, yet we still are fundamentally a racist like country. So Woodson saw February as an opportunity to bring people together, right? To have these very difficult conversations. Unfortunately, like I said at the end, I think, he passes on, so is it going to maintain the teeth that it had? But beyond any individual inheritor of that tradition, I think it's one of the prices of progress. I think a lot of people think as anything becomes more popular, like you all know, right? Like as things become more popular, more mainstream, it's hard to maintain, right, that edge when you have, I watch, basketball, right? When you've got the Wizards like state floor and the Cavs floor and the Lakers, like all these teams wearing Black History Month, when Black History Month is a product that the NBA markets, the Ford markets, that Apple markets, it becomes more difficult to keep that edge. So I hope that answers. Like, I think that he very much wanted it to be broader, but I think he was always also concerned that, well, can I still ask those hard questions, if it becomes more popular? And I don't know. I still think that's an open thing, not just for Black History Month, but for a lot of folks who want to think critically. Yes, you may get an idea out to a wider audience, but can you still have those tough, critical conversations as it expands? And that's really why I tried to end with what I think right now is a tough and difficult conversation, where we're in a moment where for so many, and that's why I was doing my research for this talk and my prep, and I found Woodson's critique of like the Lincoln arc very timely, because how does one ask a difficult question about beyond Trump, right? Right now, when we're still waiting on $2,000 checks, we're still waiting on all these things. And I think people are told, wait, take your time, it'll come, these things are happening. So I wanted to, again, situate February as how do we be critical of those who we're told have saved us? and those who we're told have helped us? And do we not have a right to be critical of them? Right. And then, I think that's a hard question, but to me, that's a Woodson kind of question. That's a Woodson kind of question where he would look at it and say, okay, what have we learned during 2020? And that's why I really tried to model from him. He was someone who said, let's look at the past 11 months and what have we learned? And I would say, okay, let's look back at the past 11 months. What have we learned about Black life and the experiences that Black people have? And we've learned that there's a lot that needs changing, right? We've learned there are a lot of people in this country who support the activities of January 6th, who fully support everything that we saw happen at the Capitol, right? Who you still have, representatives who are women of color talking about what they went through that day. So I think Woodson would look at this moment and say, he would ask, what do we have to feel good about? He would say, yes, again, as he says in that framing of Woodson, he doesn't deny, right? Some of the good things that Woodson did. He in fact talks about Douglas's relationship with him and how he was one of the first white people that Douglas met, who made him feel like, he was more of a, quote, a person than he had been previously. All that's true. And the relationship is different. So I hope that, I know I went on for a bit, but I think
it's always, I'm just trying to understand Black History Month as a vehicle. It's been commodified, as you mentioned. Perhaps it's lost its teeth. You're suggesting we need to regain the teeth or maintain them?
Yeah, and I think it has both. I do think, I want to just quickly, if I can respond, Benedict, say that I think Woodson, again, he was never one. There's an excerpt here I have from, this is from the 1950 Bulletin, which is Reddick, one of his students or mentees, responding. He says that, this is of Woodson, he says, some of the pageants he felt were too long. Apparently, they attempted to portray the entire history of the Negro people in one sitting. Woodson fought against all efforts to exploit Negro History Week or to divert it to other ends. So again, that's kind of this point, right, where he wasn't, because again, this is someone who targeted children, in every bulletin. He understood that things need to be exciting and engaging, and there was a value to having things represented and shown out in the world. It wasn't necessarily that. His thing was about proportion. He's like, what's the proportion, right? We can have, the pageantry, but we should also have the criticality. And I think that's what I would leave it at, is what about the proportion? It's not an either or. It's that perhaps the proportion we may have lost a bit, and how do we get that back?
There's a couple questions. Can you talk about his relationship with Du Bois, and did he differ on Du Bois' advocacy of socialism?
Okay. I'll speak a bit about that. Sort of say as much as I can. What I will say is that politically, what we sort of can glean and learn from Woodson is that he was really devoted to his work. I would reference, I know one of the people I mentioned was, I mentioned Joshua Myers and Greg Carr. I can drop links to you all subsequently, Benedict, and maybe you can share with the audience. I would actually leave some of the questions, particularly on his class analysis, to scholars like those. I could speculate and riff a bit from what I've learned and from what I've gleaned, but it's important to understand a lot of the texts that we get from Woodson really lock in and hone in on his analysis of the educational question and the institutional question. What I will say about his relationship with Du Bois that is pertinent here is that there were multiple instances where, remember, this is a small world. So there are multiple instances where they're working on similar projects, right? There was an encyclopedia of basically African-American or Black life project that both of them were engaged in. There was, I want to say it was Rockefeller money. Others in the group can correct me if I'm wrong, but there was Rockefeller money. The money came with strings, and Du Bois thought, he's Du Bois. So he was like, okay, they might think they're going to do this, but I'm William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. I'm going to do this the way I want to do it. Woodson saw that same project and was like, you might think that, but I'm good. So that's a metaphor or an analogy, right, situation that I would say I would use to highlight So I'll use it this way too. You can look at the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History and NAACP, right? So the NAACP emerges, which is largely associated with Du Bois. The NAACP obviously doing a lot of amazing work, both legally and politically, but again, from the outset, is very much a sort of cross-coalition, broad base building type of project where you see people from different races and different communities working at the outset. Whereas Asala, like Woodson's very clear, this is a Black organization. This is an organization that he's interested in providing opportunities and access for younger Black scholars. So that the other interesting point is I have to mention one of my colleagues, Dr. Joshua Myers, made me aware of a letter that Woodson wrote to Du Bois prior to his going to Harvard, because he knew who Du Bois was, and he said, "Hey, you've done this Harvard thing. Any advice?" You know what I mean? Like, I think that we also have to understand these two men had their back and forth. They had their public disagreements. If you go through the weeds of the research, Goggins has written the. There's a scholar named Goggins who wrote basically what I would consider really is the only sort of biographical text. That's another thing that a lot of people talk about with Woodson too. And Benedict, maybe this actually goes to your question earlier. We don't have many big biographies of Woodson. There aren't really. There's the Goggins one. There are a couple other scholars who've produced them, but you either have from his students these sort of short vignette type essays. Again, you have the memoirs of Lorenzo Johnston Green, which I think were just published a couple years ago, that give some insight, but you don't have a lot. You don't really have a ton. But to the person who asked the question, again, what I would really say in terms of distinguishing the two figures is that Woodson, they rarely say that, they say everyone has a price. It appears that Woodson, again, perhaps sometimes to his own detriment, like he was a very hard and stubborn person, and I say stubborn in a good way, like he was very, whereas Du Bois perhaps thought these people may have their intentions, but I'm me and I'm going to make this happen. Right. So Du Bois would take on, the grant or the loan or the patronage or the support, but he'd say, I can make this happen. Woodson would say, I'll do it through the center. I'll do it through the institution or the association.
Okay. We'll end there. I like the the focus on that ratio that you mentioned between celebration and criticality. It seems often to me that in many contexts that I've observed over the last few years, that the criticality can be missing sometimes.
Yeah, and it's a tough one. I thank you for bringing that up. I appreciate it, and so thank you, for the stage, for the opportunity. And I think that's, to me, the questions, may at times be uncomfortable, may be difficult, but I guess I see that as the tradition that Woodson was in for me. Like, I see that as sort of honoring the ideas that he had when it started, where to really balance that, right? Sort of the pageantry and the celebration along with the criticality and the asking the tough questions. And I think that when we look back at his work, we see both of those things coexisting. So thank you for the space to perhaps bring, Dr. Woodson's work to a new audience.
Well, thank you, Dr. Roberts. Thank you so much. I want to thank everyone. Our next lecture honoring Black History Month will be on Wednesday, February 24th, when Mary V. Thompson, the research historian at George Washington's Mount Vernon, will discuss her acclaimed book, The Only an Unavoidable Subject of Regret, George Washington's Slavery and the Enslaved Community at Mount Vernon. Again, complicating the traditional view of one of the founders. And this is a very important new book, and it is, rigorously researched. Before that, on Wednesday, February 17th, we continue our music appreciation series with Dr. Edwin Marquard, one of our favorites. His topic will be the rites of spring, Section 1, Debussy, Ravel, and Ives. So thank you again to our speaker, Dr. Roberts, and to all of you. Thank you all so much, and have a great evening. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.